March 1982. A grain elevator in the Midwest. 40 people watching, and Keith Walker was about to get laughed out of the building. He'd just rolled up on a 1953 International Harvester Farmall Super M, 29 years old, that tractor. Faded red paint, rust eating through the fenders, the kind of machine you'd see rotting in a field and think, someone should haul that to the scrapyard. Keith had paid $800 cash for it that morning. Steve Morrison saw it first. John Deere sales rep, sharp suit, sharper tongue. "Hey Walker, is that your rig out there?" Keith nodded. Steve walked to the window. His buddy Brad Cooper joined him. Both of them started laughing. Not chuckling. Laughing. The kind of laughter that makes everyone in the room turn and look. "You actually paid money for that thing?" Brad said. $800. The laughter got louder. Other farmers turned to watch. Steve shook his head like a disappointed father. "Keith, Keith, Keith, that tractor's older than you are. It's junk. Absolute junk. It runs," Keith said. "Engine's good. Transmission's solid." Brad walked over and put his hand on Keith's shoulder like they were old friends. "Listen, buddy, I get it. You're trying to save money, but this is a mistake. You can't farm seriously with equipment like that. It's inefficient. It's unreliable. Parts are impossible to find. I can fix it myself." Steve jumped in. "But why would you want to, Keith? I've got a barely used 4240 sitting on my lot right now. 3 years old, only 400 hours. I can put you in it for $32,000, 10% down. Finance the rest. Your payment would be about $550 a month." "I don't want a $550 a month payment." Brad laughed again. "You think you own that old Farmall. Keith, you own a money pit. You own something that's going to break down in the middle of planting season and leave you stranded." Several farmers were nodding in agreement. Keith felt his face getting hot. "That Farmall's been working since 1953, Keith said. "I bet it's still working in another 29 years. Can you say that about your finance tractors?" Steve smirked. "The difference is, in 29 years, our customers will have farmed thousands of acres efficiently while you're still nursing that old dinosaur along. Don't handicap yourself with junk equipment right out of the gate." Keith picked up his seed order slip and walked out. He could hear them laughing behind him. Heard Brad say to someone, "Give him 2 years. He'll be back begging us for real equipment." Keith climbed onto that old Farmall, started it up, and drove home with the mockery ringing in his ears. And then he spent the next 15 years proving every single one of them wrong. But here's what nobody knew that day at the grain elevator. Keith wasn't just trying to farm with an old tractor. He was attempting something far more dangerous. He was trying to prove that you could build a real farming operation, a growing, profitable operation, without equipment debt, without financing, without doing what every dealer in America said you had to do to succeed. March 1982. Keith Walker was 24 years old. He'd inherited 60 acres from his grandfather 6 months earlier. The land was his, free and clear, no mortgage. His grandfather had bought it in 1949 for $8,000 and paid it off by 1960. But there was no equipment. His grandfather had been leasing the ground out for 5 years. Everything had been sold at an estate sale back in 1977. Keith needed to start from scratch, and he had $5,000. That was it. $5,000 to buy equipment, seed, supplies, everything. Most young farmers would have gone to a bank, financed a used tractor for $15,000 or $20,000, payments of $300 to $400 a month. The banks were eager to lend in 1982. Agriculture was riding high. Credit was easy. But Keith had studied the economics. He'd read about farm foreclosures in the 1930s, and he was starting to see warning signs of trouble coming in the early 1980s. So he made a different choice. He went to farm auctions every Saturday for 6 weeks, looking for old tractors he could afford with cash. The 1953 Farmall came up at the Hendry's auction in March. Keith had inspected it the day before. Paint was oxidized to a dull pink red. Fenders had rust holes. Seat was torn. Gauges didn't all work. But the engine turned over smooth. Compression was good. The transmission shifted properly. The rear end wasn't whining. This was a mechanically sound tractor that looked terrible, which meant it would sell cheap. Bidding started at $1,500. Nobody bid. Auctioneer dropped to $1,200. Nothing. $1,000. Still nothing. Keith raised his hand. $800. Someone in the crowd said, "That's generous for that piece of junk." The auctioneer looked around. "I got $800. Do I hear 9? Silence. Sold to the young man for $800. Keith paid cash. Over the next 3 weeks, he went through that tractor completely. Changed all fluids, replaced filters, cleaned the carburetor, fixed an oil leak, welded up rust holes, recovered the seat. Total investment in parts, $200. His equipment fund was now down to $1,800. He still needed a plow, a disc, a planter, a cultivator. He bought all of them used at auctions over the next month. Paid cash for everything. Total equipment investment by the time he planted his first crop, $3,200 for a complete working outfit. Compare that to the dealer's offer, $32,000 for just a tractor, $550 monthly payment for 7 years. That's $46,000 total with interest, enough to buy his entire outfit 14 times over. Keith planted his 60 acres in late April, 30 acres of corn, 30 acres of soybeans. Did all the work himself with that old Farmall. The tractor was slow, maybe 4 miles per hour pulling the plow. Modern tractors could go 8 to 10. But speed didn't matter when you had time and no payment deadline hanging over you. All summer Keith farmed. Up before dawn, out in the fields until dark. The tractor ran hot in the July sun. No cab, no air conditioning. Just open air and an umbrella Keith rigged up for shade. But it never quit on him, never broke down, just kept working. People would drive by and shake their heads. Some would stop at the co-op and say, "Saw Keith Walker out there on that old piece of junk. Give him 1 season. He'll be looking for real equipment by fall." Keith ignored all of it. Harvest came in October. His corn made 92 bushels per acre. Soybeans made 35. Corn was selling for $2, 80 per bushel. Soybeans at $6.20. Total gross, 14,238. Expenses, 3,300. Net, 10,738. Not spectacular, but Keith had no equipment payments, no land payments, just property taxes and living expenses. He lived cheap that first year, rented a small apartment for $200 a month, spent maybe $8,000 on living expenses total. That left him almost $3,000. He put $2,000 in savings, used $1,000 for equipment maintenance. He'd made it through year 1. The Farmall was still running. The farm was still his, and he owed nothing to anyone. That winter at the grain elevator, Keith ran into Brad Cooper again. "Keith, how'd your first year go?" "Did fine, made a crop, tractor's still running." Brad nodded. "That's good, but you could have made a lot more with better equipment. I've still got that 4240 available." "Not interested." Brad shrugged. "Your choice, but you're leaving money on the table." Keith went home and planned his second year. Year 2 was 1983. This was the year the farm crisis really started accelerating. Interest rates were sky high, prime rate around 11%, farm loans at 15 or 16%. The Soviet grain embargo was killing exports. Prices were dropping. Land values were beginning to fall. Farmers who'd leveraged up in the late 1970s and early 1980s were starting to feel the squeeze. Equipment payments that had seemed manageable at 12% suddenly jumped to 18% when loans renewed. Income was dropping while payments were rising, but Keith didn't have equipment payments. He made another crop in 1983. Yields were down a little. Drought in July hurt both corn and beans, but he netted about $9,000, put $5,000 in savings. His savings account now had $7,000 in it. He started thinking about expansion. A neighboring farm came up for lease, the Morrison place, 80 acres. The owner had passed away. The heirs lived out of state and wanted to lease it out for cash rent, $40 per acre. That was $3,200 per year up front. Keith had $7,000 in savings. If he leased those 80 acres, he'd have $4,800 left for operating costs and living expenses. The risk was real. If he had a bad year, he might not cover the lease payment, but he'd be farming 140 acres instead of 60, more than doubling his operation. He took the risk, leased the 80 acres, planted them with the same Farmall. Took nearly 3 weeks to get everything planted, but he got it done. The 1983 harvest was decent. He netted about $14,000 farming 140 acres. After paying the $3,200 lease, he was left with about $11,000 net. Put $6,000 in savings, lived on $5,000, and then the crisis hit full force. Between 1984 and 1987, all across the Midwest, farmers were losing everything. Banks were calling loans. Foreclosures were happening monthly. Equipment that had cost $60,000 new was selling at auction for $20,000. Land values were dropping 30%, 40%, sometimes 50%. In Keith's county alone, over 40 farms went under between 1984 and 1987. One of them was Keith's neighbor to the north, Tom Bradley. Tom was 48 years old in 1984. Had been farming 320 acres since 1965, 19 years on that land. Good farmer. Everyone respected him. Did everything right, except for one decision in 1980. Tom had traded his paid-off 1970 John Deere 4020 for a brand new 4440. The dealer, Brad Cooper, the same guy who'd mocked Keith, had made it sound like a no-brainer. Tom, this is the time to modernize. Everyone's doing it. You can't compete with old equipment anymore. $8,000 trade-in value for the old 4020. $48,000 for the new 4440. Finance $40,000 at 13% over 7 years. Monthly payment $760. Tom could afford that in 1980, barely. But grain prices were high. Land values were rising 15% a year. Everyone was taking on debt. Everyone was upgrading. So Tom did it. Signed the papers. Drove home in that new 4440, felt good about it for about 2 years. Then his loan came up for renewal in early 1984. The bank offered him a new rate, 18%. Tom's payment jumped from $760 a month to over $1,000. At the exact same time, his income was collapsing. Grain prices had crashed. His 320 acres that had been netting him $45,000 a year were now only netting $25,000. His payment had gone from 20% of net income to nearly 50%. He couldn't make it. Tom tried everything, refinanced the loan, took out an operating loan of $15,000 just to plant, cut family living expenses to almost nothing. His wife Linda got a job at the grocery store. First time she'd worked off the farm in 20 years. Their 3 kids stopped doing any activities that cost money. The whole family was working to make that tractor payment. But it wasn't enough. By 1985, Tom had missed 3 months of payments. By 1986, he was drowning, borrowed money from his father, borrowed from his brother. Nothing was enough. The debt kept growing. In March 1987, Tom's bank called all his loans, demanded immediate full payment. Tom couldn't pay. The bank filed foreclosure proceedings in April. The auction was scheduled for June. Keith went to Tom's auction on a Saturday morning. Felt obligated. Tom had been a good neighbor, had helped Keith when he was starting out, had loaned him equipment, had given him advice, had never mocked him for his conservative choices. Now Tom was losing everything. The auction yard was packed, maybe 250 people. The auctioneer worked through the equipment. The 4440, the tractor that had caused all the trouble, sold for $19,000. The bank recovered $19,000 of the $46,000 Tom owed. Tom was left owing $27,000 on a tractor he no longer owned. The combine sold for $22,000. Tom had owed $31,000 on it. Tom still owed $9,000. The land, 320 acres, that Tom's grandfather had broken in 1935, that Tom's father had farmed from 1945 to 1965, that Tom had farmed since, sold for $180,000. Tom had taken out a land loan in 1981. He'd owed $210,000. Bank got $180,000. Tom still owed $30,000. Total, after everything sold, Tom owed the bank $66,000 on property and equipment he no longer had. Tom and his family moved to town 2 weeks later. Tom got a job at a factory 40 miles away, making car parts. Third shift. Linda kept working at the grocery store. Their kids got jobs after school to help. Tom died in 1999 of a heart attack at age 63. He'd worked at that factory for 12 years. Never farmed again. Never talked much about the farm after losing it. The doctors said it was heart disease. His family said it was a broken heart. Keith watched Tom's auction happen and felt survivor's guilt wash over him. Why had Keith survived when Tom hadn't? Tom was a better farmer, more experienced, worked harder, had more land. The only difference between Keith and Tom was debt. Tom had it. Keith didn't. Keith went home from Tom's auction and sat in his kitchen for 2 hours just thinking about how close he'd come to making the same choice Tom made. Thinking about Brad Cooper at the elevator in 1982 trying to sell him that 4240. Thinking about how, if he'd said yes, he'd probably be where Tom was now. And Keith kept farming with his $800 Farmall. The tractor was 31 years old in 1984, 32 in 1985, 33 in 1986. Every year people expected it to die. Every year it kept running because Keith maintained it religiously. Changed oil every 50 hours, greased every fitting, fixed small problems before they became big problems. In 1985, the Morrison heirs decided to sell their 80 acres. They offered Keith first right of refusal, asking price $48,000. Keith had been farming it for 2 years, knew the ground, knew it was worth it, but $48,000 was a lot of money. He had about $18,000 in savings. If he put that down, he'd need to finance $30,000 at crisis interest rates around 16%. That would be a payment of about $600 a month. He thought about it for 2 weeks. Finally, he made a different offer. $45,000 cash if he could have 90 days to close. The heirs, desperate to sell in a collapsing market, accepted. Keith did something he'd never done before. He went to his parents. His father was a retired factory worker with a pension and savings. "Dad, I need to borrow $12,000. I'll pay you back at 8% over 5 years. His father looked at Keith's farming records for the past 3 years, saw the steady income, saw the lack of debt, saw the discipline. Yes, Keith combined the $12,000 from his father with his $18,000 in savings, added another $15,000 from bonds his grandmother had left him. Total, $45,000. He bought the 80 acres cash. Now he owned 140 acres total, 60 from his grandfather, 80 purchased. All paid off except the personal loan to his father. He paid his father back in 4 years instead of 5. Every payment on time, every penny of interest, and he kept farming with the same Farmall. By 1987, the crisis was stabilizing. The worst was over. Farmers who'd survived were rebuilding. The ones who hadn't were gone. Keith was still farming, 140 acres. The 1953 Farmall, now 34 years old, was still his only tractor. At the elevator one day, Keith ran into Steve Morrison, the other dealer who'd mocked him back in 1982. "Keith Walker, haven't seen you in a while. Been busy farming. Still using that old Farmall?" "Yep." Steve shook his head. "I've got to hand it to you. I didn't think that tractor would last 2 years. It's been 5 now. That's impressive." "It'll last another 5 if I take care of it. You know, I owe you an apology. When you bought that tractor, I laughed at you, told everyone you'd made a mistake. I remember. Well, I was wrong. You've built something here. You're still farming. You own your ground. And a lot of guys I sold new tractors to aren't farming anymore. They lost everything in the crisis." Keith nodded. Didn't say anything. "Can I ask you something?" Steve said. "How did you know? How did you know not to take on debt when everyone else was?" "I didn't know for sure, but I figured it was safer to be small and debt-free than big and leveraged. Turns out I was right." The years after 1987 were the building years. Keith farmed his 140 acres, kept his costs low, saved aggressively, waited for opportunities. And opportunities always come to those who are patient and prepared. In 1989, another farm came available, 160 acres adjacent to his east property line. It had belonged to Mike Sullivan, who'd lost the farm in foreclosure in 1985. The bank had been sitting on it since then. Now they wanted it sold. Asking price, $96,000, $600 per acre, below market. Land in the area was worth closer to $700 per acre, but the bank wanted it gone. Keith had been saving for 4 years. He now had about $40,000 in the bank. He could put that down and finance $56,000. At current rates, around 9%, his payment would be about $700 a month. Keith thought about Tom Bradley, about how Tom's $760 monthly payment had grown to over $1,000 and destroyed him. Keith didn't like the idea of a $700 monthly payment, even though his income could support it, even though the math worked on paper. He made a different decision. Instead of taking the asking price and financing, Keith made a cash offer below asking, $80,000 cash, closing in 60 days. He waited 3 days for an answer. 3 long days. On the 3rd day, the bank's real estate agent called. "Keith, they'll accept $85,000 cash, 45 days to close. Take it or leave it." Keith took it. Now he needed $85,000 in cash in 45 days. He had $40,000 in savings. He sold stock investments, mutual funds he'd bought with farming profits. That gave him $22,000 after taxes. He borrowed $10,000 from his uncle. Same terms as with his father. That gave him $72,000. He still needed $13,000. Keith sold equipment he didn't absolutely need. A 1967 Massey Ferguson tractor he'd bought thinking he might use it. Sold it for $4,200. Sold an old combine he'd been keeping for parts. Got $3,500. Sold a few implements. Scraped together another $5,000. Total, $85,000. On day 44, Keith closed on the 160 acres. Paid cash, he now owned 300 acres. All paid off except the $10,000 personal loan to his uncle, which he paid back over the next 3 years. 300 acres that he farmed with equipment purchased for less than $5,000 total. The 1953 Farmall, now 36 years old. The 1960 Farmall 560 he'd bought in 1991 for $2,400. Both ancient, both functional, both debt-free. Keith was 31 years old and owned 300 acres free and clear. By 1993, Keith had another decision to make. He was 35 years old. He'd been farming for 11 years. He owned 300 acres, free and clear. He was making about $40,000 a year net income. He could stop here, farm his 300 acres, live comfortably, save for retirement. Or he could keep building. Another opportunity came up. The Anderson farm, 240 acres. Estate sale. The heirs wanted $144,000. Keith had $55,000 saved. If he put that down and financed $89,000, his payment would be about $400 a month at current rates. That was too high. Keith wouldn't risk it, but he made a different offer. $130,000 cash, 90 days to close. The heirs countered $135,000 60 days. Keith accepted. He went back to his father. Dad, I need to borrow $30,000 this time. Same terms as before. His father said yes again. Keith combined the $30,000 from his father with his $55,000 in savings, sold some equipment he'd accumulated, came up with $135,000, bought the 240 acres. He now owned 540 acres, all paid off except the loan to his father, which he paid back over the next 4 years, all farmed with 2 tractors purchased for a combined $3,200. The 1953 Farmall was 40 years old in 1993, still running, still working every day. By 1995, 13 years after buying that $800 Farmall, Keith Walker owned 540 acres of prime farmland. He'd bought it piece by piece, always with cash or extremely conservative financing that he paid off fast. He farmed it all with old equipment, the 1953 Farmall, the 1965-60 and 1965-806 he'd picked up at auction. Nothing newer than 1970, nothing financed. Total equipment investment over 13 years, maybe $20,000. Compare that to farmers who'd financed one new tractor in 1982 and were still making payments 13 years later. Keith's approach was working, but he still had one more opportunity coming. In early 1996, Keith got a call from a real estate agent. A large farm, 160 acres, was going to market. Owner was retiring, wanted to sell quick. Keith, I'm calling you first. Owner wants $134,000. That's $900 per acre, but he needs to close in 30 days. Keith had $65,000 in savings. Not enough, but he had another option. Over the past 13 years, Keith had built something valuable: equity. He owned 540 acres, worth conservatively $500,000 with no debt. He could take out a loan against that equity, use it to buy the 160 acres. It went against everything Keith believed. He hated debt, but the math made sense. If he took out a $90,000 equity loan at 8% over 15 years, the payment would be about $860 per month. He'd be farming 700 acres. Even with that payment, he'd be cash flowing fine. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he did it. He took out the $90,000 loan, combined it with his $65,000 in cash, bought the 760 acres, 700 acres total, 700 acres that had started with 60 acres, and an $800 tractor 14 years earlier. He paid off that $90,000 loan in 7 years, 3 years ahead of schedule. By 1997, 15 years after buying that $800 Farmall in 1982, Keith owned 700 acres, free and clear, all purchased through strategic acquisitions, all paid for with cash or conservative loans. He paid off aggressively, and he'd done it all farming with equipment so old that dealers had mocked him for buying it. The 1953 Farmall was 44 years old in 1997, still running. Keith had rebuilt it completely at least twice, but it was still the same tractor he'd bought for $800 cash 15 years earlier. In 2006, Keith got a letter from Steve Morrison, the John Deere dealer who'd mocked him back in 1982. Steve had retired in 2000, moved to Colorado. The letter said, "Keith, I'm writing to apologize. 24 years ago at the grain elevator, I mocked you for buying that old Farmall. Told you it was junk. Told you that you couldn't build a real farm operation with equipment like that. I was completely wrong. I spent 30 years selling new equipment, pushing financing, convincing farmers they needed debt to succeed. And I watched a lot of them lose everything because they took my advice. But you didn't take my advice. You bought that $800 tractor. You farmed conservatively. You built something slowly and steadily and debt-free. And from what I hear, you now own 700 acres, all paid off. I was wrong about everything. You were right about everything. I'm sorry for mocking you. You proved that the best equipment is paid for equipment, that debt-free beats leveraged every time, that slow and steady beats fast and financed. Thank you for not listening to me. Steve Morrison. Keith read the letter twice. Then he wrote back, Steve, apology accepted. I don't hold any grudge. But I want you to know something. That $800 Farmall you mocked, it's still running. 53 years old now. I rebuilt it completely last winter. It'll probably outlast me. And it taught me something. The value of equipment isn't in how new it is. It's in how much freedom it gives you. That old Farmall gave me the freedom to farm through bad years without losing everything. The freedom to build slowly without pressure. The freedom to make conservative choices because I wasn't desperate to cover payments. You didn't just sell tractors, Steve. You sold a way of thinking. And that way of thinking destroyed a lot of good farmers. I'm glad you see it differently now. Keith Walker. Steve wrote back one more time. Keith, you're right about everything. I wish I'd learned it 30 years ago. Keep farming. Keep that Farmall running. Keep proving there's a better way. Steve. Keith Walker is 66 years old now. He still farms 700 acres. Still owns all of it free and clear. His son James farms with him now, learning the same lessons Keith learned. The 1953 Farmall Super M that Keith bought for $800 in 1982 is still on the farm. It's 71 years old as of 2024. Keith finally retired it from fieldwork in 2019 after 66 years of service. But he keeps it running, uses it for light work around the farm, maintains it perfectly. That tractor cost him $800 to buy, maybe another $10,000 in maintenance, and rebuilds over 42 years of use, total investment, under $11,000. It helped him farm 700 acres. Helped him build an operation worth over $4 million at current land values. Return on investment, roughly 36,000%. The dealers who mocked him, most are retired or out of business. The farmers they sold new tractors to, many lost everything in the farm crisis. The few who survived are still making payments on replacement equipment. But Keith owns everything, free and clear. Built with an $800 tractor and conservative choices that everyone said would fail. Recently, a young farmer came to visit Keith, asked him for advice on starting out. What would you tell someone starting from scratch today? Keith thought for a long time. I'd tell them what I learned. Don't confuse new with necessary. Don't confuse debt with investment. Don't confuse what dealers say you need with what you actually need. That $800 Farmall everyone mocked? It was the smartest purchase I ever made. Not because it was efficient, not because it was modern, but because it was paid for. And paid for equipment gives you something new. Equipment never can. Freedom. Freedom to farm through bad years. Freedom to take opportunities when they come. Freedom to build slowly and steadily without panic. The dealers will tell you you need new equipment, that you can't compete without it, that financing is smart, that everyone's doing it. But I bought an $800 tractor everyone said was junk, and 15 years later I had 700 acres, built with that junk, built with conservative choices, built with freedom from debt. So that's my advice. Buy what you can afford to own. Farm what you can afford to keep. Build what you can afford to maintain. And don't let anyone tell you that slow and debt-free is worse than fast and leveraged. Because in the long run, the guy still farming always beats the guy who farmed big and lost everything. Right now, Someone's mocking your conservative choices. Someone's laughing at your old equipment. Someone's telling you that you can't build anything real without taking on debt. But in 1982, John Deere dealers mocked Keith Walker when he paid $800 cash for a 29-year-old Farmall. They laughed at him in front of 40 people, told him it was junk, told him he couldn't farm seriously with it, told him he'd be begging for real equipment within 2 years. 15 years later, Keith had 700 acres, built with that $800 tractor, built with conservative decisions, built with cash purchases and strategic acquisitions, built by refusing to follow the crowd into debt. Those dealers, most are out of business. Their customers, many lost their farms. The ones who survived are still making payments. But Keith owns 700 acres, free and clear. And that old Farmall is still running after 71 years. Because the best investment isn't the newest equipment, it's the equipment you own. The equipment that gives you freedom. The equipment that lets you farm through bad times without losing everything. If this story changed how you think about equipment, debt, and what it really means to build long-term wealth, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who built empires with equipment everyone said was worthless. Second, drop a comment. What did you buy cash that everyone mocked, but that ended up being the smartest decision you ever made? Third, share this with someone who's being told they need to finance new equipment they can't afford. Someone who needs to hear that there's another way. Dealers mocked him when he paid $800 cash for that old Farmall. 15 years later, he had 700 acres, and that old Farmall is still running today. Sometimes the thing everyone mocks is the only thing that saves you.